Hi, everybody. Good evening, and we are so happy that you found us here in the theater, despite the crazy traffic and left over from the Grand Prix. Thank you for coming out. You've got lots of choices of things to do in this city, and we always really love it when you put the Dali Poetry Series on your list and make it here, especially when it takes this kind of effort. But we have an amazing night of poetry for you tonight. We have Dali Lawless, who has his brand new book out. Super excited to help him launch that. And also Dennis Nurksey visiting with us from Brooklyn. So I'm just so excited to have both of you here. I want to first do a shout out to the city of St. Petersburg, who has supported this program, gosh, going on 9 years now. We really do appreciate it, and also a shout out to the great staff here at the museum that's been supportive. Dr. Hank Hine, whom I hope will be joining us a little bit later. He tries very hard to come to this program. He's a poet himself and just adds so much to what we do. Also, Dr. Kim McQuarrie, I think she's in the back. Thomas in the back, who's our tech czar, along with John Fisher. Joy Garrett Douglas, I think, is back there too, maybe. So anyway, thank you to all of you for your help. So one of the things that Hank has asked that I do at the start of every program is read just one of my own poems. So I'm going to do that tonight. But really, what I'm doing it for today is that this is National Women's History Month, right? So it felt fitting to read a poem that, although it's actually in Dali's voice, it's really about Gala, because those of you who, and probably most of you here in this theater, are very familiar with who she is and the role she played in Dali's life. And she is credited by most everybody as having so much to do with his success. She was so much more than his muse, but she was also his muse. She was his only female model. And she was his business partner, and she's really the reason he made his work made it here to America. I mean, she was integral in every part of his work. So it just seemed right to read a poem about that. So I will do that, and then I'm going to introduce our poets. We will start with Dani, and then we'll have Dennis read, and then, as usual, afterwards we'll do our Q&A. So. This is a poem that was actually taken from a book written by Conrad Maddox, his book on Dali. So the event comes from that book. Come on in. You can find a seat anywhere. You're welcome.
Come up front, Margot.
That's even better. This is called Dali's First Date with Gala. Of course, I'd go to extremes. She wasn't surprised. I chopped my best shirt short enough to expose my navel and ripped it on the shoulder and chest, then wrestled my breeches inside out, shaved my armpits, and dyed them electric blue. It wasn't enough. I scoured them till they were bloody, my knees too. I detested eau de cologne. It made me sick. So I boiled fish glue and water, adding goat manure and a touch of aspic, making a paste I rubbed all over my body. But when I saw her approaching my courtyard door, that angle of her hair, her cheeks, I realized what I hadn't known till then. My creation was a nuptial costume. But it was prepared, my God, too soon. Panicked, I scrubbed off the smear of the concoction and ran to greet her, only to collapse at her feet in maniacal laughter. He's an odd bird. Thank you. Thank you. So we will start, let's see, hang on 1 minute, with Dali Wallace, whose bio, I think I maybe left over there, but I'm going to read it right off his book. I want you to see his brand new book. This is his book called I Tell You This Now, and it's just out. Dali, would you pronounce the name of your press so that I don't mess it up? What is it?
Geneva Marva.
Okay, Geneva Narva, Barbara, and that's in Somerville, Massachusetts. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Dali Wallace's extraordinary book, I Tell You This Now, dazzles with poetry's power and negative capability. This is actually a blurb by Dennis Nertsky. I should have you read it, really. It has courage to be vulnerable even in the moment of insight, to work at the threshold where the self ends and the street begins, to be the animal that knows it will die. It's an anarchic power that subverts all authority, including the speakers. Adamant in their modesty, their generosity and ferocity, these poems can critique the absolutes, the giving of names, Daniel, the arc of time, sleek green car, emptiness itself. Always these poems speak to the real, the loved, the broken. Always the work is haunted by injustices we suffer and inflict in a world which is collapsing inwards. Then a bit about Dali himself. Dali has read with us a couple times here before. He read after his first book came out, and that first book was called The Gun My Sister Killed Herself With. Some of you may have been here for that amazing reading. His recent poems appeared in Field, Barrow Street, Prairie Schooner, Plowshares, Poetry International, Los Angeles Review, Solstice, Manhattan Review, Massachusetts Review, and Dreaming Awake, new prose poems from the U.S. From the U.S., Australia, and the U.K., among others. A recipient of a continuing Shifting Foundation grant, he is the founder and editor of Plume, a journal of contemporary poetry. Plume editions in the annual Plume Poetry Anthologies. And if you're not familiar with that journal, that anthology, you want to be. Dali, he is the most self-effacing person I know, but he's almost the most brilliant person I know as well. So you need to get that journal to be able to read his introductions, if not for all the poems themselves. Please give a warm welcome to Dali Wallace. And kudos on your new beautiful book.
Thank you, Helen, and it's good to be able to work with one who blurbs your book. Thank you, Dennis. I feel like I'm the warm-up act for Dennis. He is just the most astonishingly good poet that I know, so I'm very privileged to be here. And if Hank shows up, I'll thank him as well. But Helen, that was a wonderful introduction. So,
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I think I
All right. So, because I'm old, I won't read from the pages of the book. I printed them out in like 16 prints. So, the poems in the book run through. It's not sectionalized. They kind of run through. But as I thought about this reading, I realized that they do fall into a couple of categories or several categories. One is about my youth and family, which has had many troubles. I had 3 siblings, and they all became schizophrenic about right after puberty, and I was the one who did not. I did other horrible things, but it wasn't, I didn't become ill. So I'll write a couple of poems about my family, and then maybe a love poem to my wife, and then a few elegies. And I'm hoping I'll have a moment to read a poem from my other book that I never got a chance to read in public, but it's about, I assume most of you here write poetry. I mean, people who come to poetry readings almost always write poetry as well. So it's a poem in the form of an email to a poet who accosted me at an airport and gave me a sheaf of poems to read. And I read the poems on the way back. So if I have time, I'll read that, but we'll see. So,
Can you all hear in the back?
Can you hear? I know my wife is always saying, so soft-spoken. Okay, so the first one is, I was going through a box of photographs before we sold the family home, and one of them was about my brother, and the poem was titled, Family Photograph, My Brother, Solar Eclipse, 1965. In a year, Haldol, ECT, the closed gates of a sanatorium. But for now, how happy you were. To be 11 and unconcerned for once with school, the Cubs, who punched who. For a few minutes to be unlearned, to be taught a new world. Oh, distant boy, how marvelous it all must have been. To be turned into a ghoul with your friends, to spurn the murmur of grown-ups with their high balls and hair on the deck for a lowering sky burned sepia, orange. At 3 o'clock to feel yourself disappear inside yourself, to cast no shadow. And so long ago now, how did you put it? The delicious, insistent thought, what if it stays like this? To yearn and yet not to know yet what that yearning meant. Thank you, thank you. This is another one about my childhood. All of you guys, I would imagine, have, lightning bugs. Yes, in the South, we call them lightning bugs. I think other people call them fireflies, but it always seems a little precious to us, so we call them lightning bugs. But this is about most of these are very short. This is called Not Fireflies. And it's about probably a little sliver of an hour or so of my life when I was younger. Not fireflies in the South, but plainer, lightning bugs. Not, as the poets would have it, you deers carrying your little lanterns beside you. Green stars or the faulty strike of a match. Not as you once imagined the visiting souls of your dead parents. Only you, poor boy, lonely god of the backyard, and these flickering insects trapped in a juice glass, to be smeared between your fingers or tapped with a stick, set free with a magician's flourish, according to your cold, your wondrous heart. And this one is, I don't write a lot of love poems. This one is about a man in a long marriage who has fantasized about leaving his wife until something reminds him of what they had once had and might still. And I have a question for Dennis later about this kind of fidelity, but we'll talk about that later. We each have to ask one another a question, I think. This one's called Coincidence, a love poem. Let's face it, it had been another one of those days. I can still see us. I with my Sunday macchiato, my graying head as usual buried in the real estate section of Le Mans. You with your hot chocolate and extra sweater, cross-stitching yet another blankie for someone's grandson, Jake. As we sat as usual in companionable silence on our regular afternoon bench outside Shelton's, each of us, it seemed, trying not to remember it was our 32nd anniversary. But love was just then, as I was trying to decide this time for good, between un champ pierre de terre dont le côtier animé 18e, or perhaps un cosy appartement vigneron près de Montpellier historique. Anyway, it was exactly then that you put down your knitting and smiled and handed me the muffin from Levin's you'd saved in your purse all morning, carefully wrapped in tinfoil under a sturdy paper towel and wound tight with 2 twist ties, but still so fragrant with cardamom, sweet Carolina ginger, and wild cloudberries. This next one, there are going to be 3 elegies here. Sorry about that. Kind of, as you can tell from the convivial title of my former book, The Gun My Sister Killed Herself With, they tend towards a little bit of the dark side, I suppose. But this one, these 3 elegies actually are kind of hopeful and nice, I think. So we'll see. This one's called From the Afterlife. And it's a poem that came to me. Pardon me? Pardon me? You guys are, yeah, okay, yeah. This one came to me partly in a dream, and it was a person important to me in my life, and she was telling me after she had passed away that the place she had come to was okay, and it made me feel good. So this is called From the Afterlife. My last days were not so bad, my ex-wife says, from the afterlife. Not so bad as you think, so relax. The home helpers you hired didn't steal from me, as far as I knew, neither money or my dilaudid, or have their boyfriends over as if I were blind and deaf. I especially like the Dominican Alea. Lord, the stories she could tell. I read, watched a lot of television, if you can believe it, baseball, if you can believe it, Maddow, the food shows. You remind me a little of Bourdain, sexy but no beast. Seriously though, chilaquiles, tartiflette, I don't think I weighed 90 pounds. Can you imagine? White as a ghost. But here's the thing, happy, Daniel. You can't imagine. What did Thoreau say? I grew like corn in the night on the inside. Well, there was only the real inside, really. I was flying inside myself like Bill Knott. It was dark, but I wasn't scared. I made my own life. Light, a biofluorescent jellyfish, like at Monterey. Other times I sprouted legs, long, beautiful legs with glitter-spritzed toenails, like Alea's. I remember visiting her mother's orchard. I was the higher lechosa on the tree no one could reach. What did the French say? The disparition, when I woke up, I had disappeared. My old grass hut, lived in now by another generation, is decked out with dolls, wrote Basho. Does that help, Daniel? Or remember that trip to Lucerne? Imagine it went on forever. Not so bad. I, watching you write my name in fogged breath on a window pane and watching it disappear, stepping outside some inner other after the thunderclouds rode past, everything calm, reticent. How like the Swiss we could see the Alps everywhere from wherever we were standing. Thank you. And this little one it's actually the centerpiece of the book and contains the title of the book. And I guess the only thing you need to know, most of you know who Robert Bly is, the poet Robert Bly and the translator. Before he got into Iron John and the men's movement stuff, he was a wonderful poet. I remember in the translations, he did a lot to introduce a lot of people. Yeah, you know, he kind of went off the rails a little bit, but his first book, Silence in the Snowy Fields, was extraordinary to me and meant a lot to me at the time. And so he is mentioned in this poem. And it's called, I Tell You This Now, Tom, Because You Are Dead. In 1977, when the tornado as hunger blows through bodies blew through the nearby cemetery, leaving only the chattering teeth of old gravestones and the naked carotene trunks of toppled elms. When it snatched up the adjacent Carmelite cloister and shook it, impaling two young postulants on shards of exploding rafters as they huddled in the chapel, before heading further east to visit a nursing home and wreathe an infant in barbed wire. I was alone in a quiet basement library room in a college, reading Robert Bly's Silence in the Snowy Fields. I tell you this now, Tom, because you are dead, because speaking to the flawed dead who are perfect now is easy. As I lean again tonight over your body and stare a long time into your eyes as through a train window veiled with soft dust, until the words I read then, but never got a chance to say come to me as a few simple wishes. That despite the anguish and crazy hungers that spiraled through your life, you too might have known the calm I knew that afternoon of iron mailbox handles in dark tire tracks in snow, and somehow understood the salvation of guinea hens hidden from the hired girl's hatchet in impossible places, asleep in the trees, even if that salvation was not yours. That if you trembled in your hospital bed, it was only the slight trembling of words on white pages opened on a table, like the trembling of grass or water deep in the wells, that is temporary. A wish that says, after the terrible whirlwind blew through, it was as if on a train the conductor had poked you and you arrived out of the darkness, suddenly awake to a strange new city, utterly happy. Thank you. And maybe I'll forego, there's too much time here. I'll forego the next, this is an easy, short one. It's called Etched Pewter Bird. And you know those silver birds you sometimes buy, they're kind of heavy and the top comes off and they're open up and they're hollow. And people put little beads in them, I guess, and that kind of thing. I have one on my desk, and I got the news that somebody had passed away, a good friend. And so this is about the bird and the friend. I'll tell you, unfortunately, the bird takes up a lot of space in this poem and my friend doesn't show up probably until the last few lines. But then when the person does show up, I hope you make sense or make the connection. So it's called Etched Pewter Bird. You who are empty and so neither desire the expensive organic seed mix or require the attentions of the fastidious vet, who do not cheep so psychotically cheerfully that sometimes I want to throttle you. You who do not retreat coyly from my outstretched hands or tremble wildly if I hold you, who never once perched spitefully in the branches of the thorny locust tree behind the garage after I left your cage door ajar in summer or in other seasons mockingly eluded my ridiculous broom. You who fix your Aventine eye indifferently upon me at all times, unlike real birds who, if they regard me at all, regard me suspiciously or skeptically and keep their distance as if they are tourists guarding their passports. You, in other words, little generic etched pewter bird in my desk, who should signify nothing at all to me, in fact, except from across the country. The news arrived not 8 hours ago yet, this windless December night, that my oldest friend in this world is dead, and there isn't anything she or I can do about that. And my heart, oh, my stunned heart on its cupola of ribs is cold now as your weather-vane double, nameless, hollow, not hawk or a sparrow. I'll read just a couple of, there's one of the sections in the book is devoted to definition poems, where I take a word and think about the associations that occur to me from it. And there are probably 5 or 6 of them. I'll read maybe 2. I'll just read 2 of them. The first one's called Once. Beautiful gliding word, although perhaps less a word than an exhalation. Circa 1300, a simple adverbial generative, an F like S becomes CE, affixed to the Middle English ane, meaning formally at one time, per the OED. Nevertheless, its intent always complex, contextual. Sometimes a little wince in there, a little ache. Desire too, and wonder. Once we begin, our lips puckered as if for a kiss, but a kiss that never comes, breathless, forever in the past. And this other word one is called Freudenschreck. Say it along with me, Freudenschreck. It's a German word I'd stumbled across. This one, I think Eugene Meatyard shows up in this. He's a Kentucky, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and he's a great, great photographer, spent a lot of time at the University of Kentucky. And then I kind of fused it with an article that I had read, which is pretty unsettling, actually. So Freudenschreck is the name of it. Freudenschreck, or intense pleasure fright. Leave it to the Germans to coin a word for the fleeting sense of being seized by such an inexplicable joy it verges on terror. Or maybe it's inexplicable terror pretending to be joy. Also a physical phenomenon. Neurologists say the amygdala glows red as a jackball, whether subjects gaze at images of planetesimals or gallows. Picture a joyride, the Appalachian pin brides of Eugene Meatyard. Put yourself in the shoes of Ayanna Clemens, 44, of Peru, Indiana, a longtime congregant of the Endays Christian Church, according to the Gazette, who may have had a seizure that caused her to shiver all over. Although another passerby reported hearing her shout, "Praise him," or "Praise God," before she sort of rocked him before casting that beautiful child into that cold river. That's a sad one. That's a sad one. All right. I'm almost done here. I'll read a little short one of the word ones, and then I'll read this other thing from the book and we'll be done. I'll give you a quiz. Anybody know what an aglet is? Damn, you're good. You're good, because I didn't know it at the time. Very good. Yeah, very well done. Well done. So this one's called aglet. A bloodletting tool, a vestigial claw. I mean, these are the things that sort of, it's the aglet brought to my mind. A liturgical vestment, a kind of stitch or stenographical notation, a vase, a fresh-born eel. It's fun now to imagine it could be any of these, but in 1967, the right answer was the little sheath at the end of the shoelace. Da's nightly vocabulary quiz, home from the Clifton Cab Yard, the summer before Sean and I would try for posh hymns. Years ago now, but I can still see it, his pressed shirt and flocked cap, that pipe he claimed the mayor himself had given him. The two of us watching a drop of spittle trickle the length of its lacquered stem as he continued, from the old French, aiguille, needle, to point or pierce, colloquially, a small sorrow. My father. And now I'll read this poem that I kind of always wanted to read about the editor and the guy giving me the poems. So we met in this airport, we had an Applebee's. And he took an avid interest eventually in poetry, which I should have kind of woken up to, like, this is not going to end well, maybe. And he did give me a lot of poems. And I wrote the poem, as you have it, mostly on the flight that we diverged. He took off one way to another flight, and I took mine. And I wrote most of the poem on the way on that flight. So I will say that It's kind of an odd little thing, or it's the longest poem here, I'm sorry. This Allen Ginsberg's Howl is here in Big Ten football. A lot of otters in this poem. Heraclitus shows up, and Arthur C. Clarke, a patch of black ice, and Oscar Wilde. So that's kind of the material for the poem. That should probably do it. Okay. And it's called Over Northern Virginia, October 18th, from emails to a young poet, playing on, of course, letters to a young poet. This one to Frank, my barmaid at Applebee's, as at 35,000 feet, I still see and overhear myself shouting, "Say hello to Dolores," toward the receding Stetson in the full flush of 4 Dos Equis, and promise. And so we head for our separate gates after our little bro tango of Trump and Big 12 football that somehow clacked its 4 floor chimes right off the dance floor into the starry dynamo of the machinery of night. Or was it Dora? Anyway, although somehow I don't envision you as the type to be caught cowering in unshaven rooms in your underwear, or burning cigarette coal in your arms, or testing the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, I could be wrong. A great poet, if not an angel-headed hipster, might be slouching under that Lux salesman getup. Okay, maybe not a great poet, but not a terrible one either. Like most of us, you have your moments. I'm thinking of the best one, about the otters. Their steady gaze upon me like the blank pages of old calendars. I'm not sure what it means, but I sense something wise here, something zazen that doesn't do time or regret. Or maybe I'm jealous. The otters I've met mostly have taken one look at me and skedaddled. The little pouches under their arms where they keep spare rocks to hammer open sea urchin shells, you say? I didn't know that. It reminds me suddenly of my uncle Alejandro, whom I adored, a hairy little man with big enemies who carried a derringer in his pocket through the dim alleys of Cicero, Illinois. And who would have thought romp or raft was their group name, that some, contra the sea urchins, are actually ovo-vegetarians. Do you know the word sapiosexual? It means a person who finds intelligence to be the most attractive feature in a human being. Noble, but in the end doomed. The first girl I kissed on the lips was a budding 15-year-old Egyptologist. Her thin tongue slithered in my mouth like a dry hieroglyph for a few seconds, and that was that. Enter her husband, lithe, big-breasted Ophelia. What I mean is, these otter facts are good things to know, but not the lingering scent of a Jean Nette on your neck, not one ragged, unpainted toenail. They like privacy and magic. What else? The word empire, not to nitpick, but while I can imagine myself as an otter on the shore bowing to an otter king waving his paw when he floated by on his back, I'm not sure how far his fur regalia would be different from mine. Would he sport epaulettes and a crown of some kind, like a cartoon, or do you mean it in the Orwellian sense? All otters are kings, but some are kinglier than others, smarter or fatter, their coats glossier, perhaps. Explore? And wouldn't he be on top of, not inside, the royal carriage of the river? Then things really go haywire. In stanza 3, the black fluidity of space in the amphoria of the frontal lobes sounds to me like Heraclitus and Arthur C. Clarke had been standing a little too close in the poetry elevator. And how does this relate to consciousness exactly? By the time a few times later we get to the giant, your father, and his shirt front confettied with scattered Pall Mall flakes, you've lost me. The otter has left the building. So Frank, imagine me putting on my editor's hat. Unfortunately, like the other ones, loneliness with otters is not. And now, taking that hat off again. Maybe it's not for anybody. What I mean is how to say it. I'm no horticulturist, but a few days ago, I was leafing through one of my wife's international field guides and came across an orchid called the Rhizantalia gardenia. Dime-sized, apparently it lives its entire life unseen, compressed in underground crevices in Western Australia, where over generations its scent develops wild, unheard of intensities, many multiples of the common rose. Does that help? Or what's the line, the bird the painter doesn't paint that makes the whole sky bluer? Something like that. On a personal note, decades ago, I did a good thing, a small thing, involving black ice in a station wagon full of teenagers, but told no one. Just the thought of it all these years has been like a nightlight in the back of my brain, illuminating some pretty dark stairs, a lot of gray, solemn afternoons. Anyway, gotta go now, buddy. I can see the lights of Newark from my window seat. Christmas ornaments smashed to smithereens. Gotta unplug, gather up all these goddamn cords, stuff them into my computer case and text my brother-in-law. By now, I'd guess you're halfway to that convention in Dallas. Maybe you're thinking about Dolores or Dora, scarfing peanuts, maybe starting to write another poem inspired by the curlicued blue ribbon on the woman's head crowning over the seat in front of you, the way it bobs like an amberjack lure, and the steady stream of cold air rushing from the little nozzle. I can see that, but Frank, don't. Leave that woman's head alone. Just this once for me, permit that ribbon to unfurl unmolested with all the majesty it can muster, which is a lot. Remember what I said about the flower, the bird, and the good thing? The power of compound interest is astonishing in the inner life, too. What did Oscar Wilde say? Only secrecy makes modern life mysterious or marvelous. That was my advice to the book. And last, two terribly short ones. One about my name. You know that feeling you get when you're walking by a window and you see your own reflection in the mirror and how frightening that can be and how jarring. Or you see your name intertwined in some graffiti. That was the interest I had in it. This one's called Daniel. Daniel, my name, shared with many others, dead and living, a few famous, most not, yet with each of whom I feel an elusive but undeniable kinship, meaningless in my mouth as it must be in the ears of my niece's pet rabbit, stale bread on the lips of others. My twin, according to the ancients. For the romantics, the shadow with whom a man travels all his days. But is it I who look like you, or you like me? And if you are like my constant shadow, why then, whenever we meet, is it always as if for the first time, Daniel? How is it, even etched on this familiar park bench on 77th Street, set among overturned pink children's bikes and wildflowers, you somehow frighten me? And the last one, this is very brief. Childhood. You know how when you're a kid, objects, you're pretty much indifferent to most of life, as objects mean quite a bit to one as you move through the world. And this is called, it's only about 8 lines. Childhood. Though childhood is not what a child would know to call it, her corpus callosum isn't quite connected yet. And anyway, why would she want to? When you're 6, you're a ghost inside another ghost, unpierceable by anything in the substantial world, where this and this and this keeps happening. A knob of milky quartz juts out of a rock. There's a man on the moon, a box of matches adorned with a key. You wear your life lightly as the dog you name wears the name you name it. Sorry. And now for the real star of the show, Dan.
That was great. Thank you. Wow, so I love that last line. Can you say that one more time? That the name, you say that?
You wear your life lightly as the dog you name.
The dog you name. That's a great last line. And the whole book, it's out front. I hope you'll buy it. It's really amazing. Danny's book, I Tell You This Now. Notice all the little Thanks. I wanted to say that our executive director, Dr. Hank Hine, has joined us. Hank, thanks for being here. We're glad that you could make it. And also, we have our state poet laureate, Peter Meinke. And Gretchen Meinke is here. Also, a former professor of mine from my grad school days, Hunt Hawkins, Dr. Hunt Hawkins, and his wife, also a writer, Elaine Smith. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. And now we have the pleasure of hearing Dennis Nurksey read from his 12 collections of poetry. I don't know how many of those he'll actually read, but this is his book from 2022, A Country of Strangers, New and Selected Poems. Between Danny's book and this book, I'm going to be busy for the next few months because you can't just read them. I mean, you really have to study them. I love trying to figure out how the two of you work the magic you do in such a seamless and easy going way. It's, when we all know it's, of course, not that way. But Dennis Nurksey's 12th poetry collection, A Country of Strangers, A New and Selected, was published by Knopf in 2022. His poetry has received a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, 3 Pushcart Prizes, and appeared in 6 editions of Best American Poetry, The New Yorker, Poetry, and the Paris Review. Dennis has also worked in human rights extensively, served a term on the board of Amnesty International, USA, and taught at Rikers Island. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Beth Boswell, who's also a writer, and the wild puppy, Zephyr. Welcome, please, to Dennis Nurksey. You have to really speak down into that.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me? How is the mic working?
Microphone, it's hard to hear.
Okay,
Give him a minute, because it sounds pretty good, Margot.
let me know if you can't hear me. The last reading I did, I asked people that, and then at the end of the reading, they said, we enjoyed that, but we couldn't hear a word you said. And I said, well, why didn't you tell me? And they said, well, we were way too polite. So I hope you're not like that. And it's a thrill for me to be reading with Danny, a poet I much admire. We come from some similar sources. We've read some of the same poets when we were kids. And I love his work. And thank you to Helen Wallace. Thank you to the Dali Museum. I'm going to start with a love poem. And again, can people hear me okay? It's yes? Late summer. When the rain woke me, I no longer knew and had to remind myself, this is darkness. That is the wine glass. This is the blowing curtain. That's the immense city. It's late in my life, but early in August. This is my wife naked in my arms. And I'm going to read a few poems to my father. My father was from Estonia. My parents met on a boat out of Portugal in 1940. Very romantic meeting, fleeing the Nazis. And then they kind of argued with each other for about 10 years as to whether they would get married. He wanted to marry her, and she said no. And then she said, okay. And he said, well, in that case, I don't want to marry you. But anyway, they finally worked it out, and here I am. But this poem is to my father. The dim tenements. What I asked my father, is behind a wall. When you see a lit window through the rain, down a dark street, who lives there? When a car swishes past after midnight, sudden and decisive, where is it going? The voices in the alley, laughing and sobbing, what are they talking about? My father sighed and rolled his eyes furtively. It was an expression he had perfected during the fall of Poland. He cracked his knuckles, a hollow sound. He explained, behind the wall is another wall. The rain doesn't know itself. The car is fleeing. The voices have no idea what they're saying. When you come to the lit window at the end of life, I will be waiting for you, but the room will be empty. God's War. When my father died, he still waited for me after soccer practice in his dusty liberal Volvo, double parked on a side street of Botanicas and Jiffy Lubes, a no-name hotel and a store that sold star maps. Always in the past it was spring. Always he had just died. Always I kept him waiting deliberately, bragging to my friends about the goal I scored against Hamilton Park, across from the deep wing, a header, the goalie flailing. I still remember the elms of his street, the minnowy leaves riddled with tiny holes like braille. Names were gouged in the bowls, savagely sealed with sap. If I make no apology, I thought, perhaps he won't even notice. His wristwatch was stone. So were his glasses and his times. Yet there he was, day after day, patient and bemused, loyal to a fault, my father. Death had changed him less than the war, God's war, the war against the statues. And my parents had come from that world of a lie spreading, a civilization falling apart. They kind of knew too much. They were traumatized. And I think that led me to be a poet, because I started to feel that people knew a lot more than they were letting on. And this is a poem about my father again, Return from Flint. After my father died, the other children were kind and took great delight in giving me secret gifts, a jujube hermetically sealed in cellophane, a goose feather with a bent tip, a book of Ohio blue tip matches. They allowed me to win at stoop soccer, whistle ball, all their impenetrable games whose rules are like the law, decipherable only when broken. The girls invited me to walk with them under tall, sticky pines, pulsing with a trance of crickets. Cindy kissed me. A girl with no name touched my earlobe experimentally. Teacher let me pass the pyramid test, though I answered at random, just a whirl of zeros. Even the blue dog followed me home. Our cat brought me a sparrow, still flying gravely in its mouth. I was confused. Were they bribing me? If they loved me, it was strange as swallowing a moth. My mother made my birthday meal, large meatballs mixed with small, Swedish and Italian, though even I understood she moved like a puppet on strings of supernatural fatigue. That night I had my favorite dream, my father lifting me in strong arms out of Monday into Friday, out of July into November, out of childhood into old age. I'm going to read a slightly different, more contemporary poem. This poem is set in 2016. The Screen. I asked my mother to visit and watch a woman being elected president. We sat in front of cable news. I swear we each thought of holding hands. After 20 minutes, we began to fidget. She excused herself to the bathroom. I chose to take a call. I buried my eyes in my cell. Our city had grown so silent. Where were the ambulances, the low-flying jets? A car passed with a rattle of a loose fan belt. A child cried in the next building. I have to go, my mother said suddenly, home to feed my Maltese. I helped her into her coat and found her gloves. We hugged a little stiffly. I heard her steps diminish in the corridor. I was left facing the screen. I tore myself away and followed her. She is old, old. I rode the next elevator down. Were our streets ever so dark? The lamps were shining with a prissy glow that disclosed nothing, that smudged whatever it touched, but I saw a silhouette with her adamant shuffle and followed it into the cold. I watched from a block away as she hailed a cab, clambered in gimpily, lit a cigarette, and began chatting. The car sped away toward Queens. So it is long ago, I thought. She can smoke and flirt. Perhaps I'm not even born yet. And I began walking endlessly in our vast city. Doors flew open, and the faces there were the children who died in the church in Birmingham, in Lowndes County and Neshoba, but the high windows were blank and pulsed with a shuddering blue light. That was a prose poem, and this is another prose poem. I used to teach in prison, and it was a painful experience, but it was great for me as a writer because the prisoners were totally into poetry, and sometimes we feel that poetry is something that happens in an MFA program. I remember one kid whose name was Antonio Sabater, and he wrote, "Just the thought of me in someone else's mind gives me the chills." And I thought of that isolation where you couldn't even imagine another person thinking of you, how different that life was from mine. This poem is called The White Prisons. The kids ask, "Do you also teach in the white prisons?" There are white suburbs, white libraries, white hospitals, churches, parks, and ball fields. Why wouldn't there be white prisons? Snow pulses in a tiny barred window. an idea at once vague and obsessive. The kids have been writing their poem. It starts with a blank page, a doodle in the margin, but soon you are a child in the streets. Oily slush seeps up through the soles of your Nikes. You pass a Burger King, Zion Redeemer, the ironworks under sleet. Pitkin Avenue does not go all the way to morning. The white Lexus appears out of nowhere. Where to run? Icy stoops, steel-shod doors. I expect to live another 3 years, maybe 2 and 6 weeks, 6 weeks and 7 days, probably to my 19th birthday. It happens every night in my mind. The long street, the hour before dawn, the white Lexus, my enemy's face in the tinted window, so familiar, so masked. And those kids all did have an idea of the day they would die. Much like Federico Garcia Lorca, and many of them are dead by now. I'm going to conclude with maybe 2 poems. This is a love poem. The Body. A small animal, perhaps an otter, darted under our wheels. My wife was driving. No time to swerve. I sensed no impact. She braked. I scrutinized the tarmac for blood. Nothing, not a scrap of fur, though the road seemed to hum, alert as skin to the touch, reek of pepper and must, pent-up hush of late summer. Behind a scrim of willows, a glint seemed to slip backwards, too. Before we were born, we found ways not to exist, happily, playfully, thriving on no fish 1 billion years before the universe exploded. No one missed us. We didn't miss ourselves. There was no absence. 3, leery of ticks, we part ash leaves, and there's Gihon River. An ant clinging stoically to a frayed petal, a bee flying gamely underwater. 4, evening, we won't come back to this angle of scorched tar, logged, forest choked with brush, clouds hunched behind a cliff, a forest, lights as we watch, a farmhouse porch, a kitchen like a child's toy. You can hear a little one intoning the score of a jump rope game, solemnly with sleepy urgency, as if blurting out a secret, every syllable held and slushed in the loud shush of current. Radio signals link galaxies, but we're so close. All we know of ourselves is the blur of an eyelash. After us, the white line, the wall of pines. I think we all fear death, and I used to have that thought of, well, nothing bad happened before I was born. I mean, eternity goes both ways. Eternity goes into the past, too. A physicist would say it's the same eternity. And it was all fine. And then I read there is like a phobia of, there are people who are terrified of the expanse of time before they were born. So I guess that meager comfort doesn't work for everybody. And I'm going to conclude with a prose poem with a child in it. A clearing on Ruth Island. The child sees the firefly far off in the birches. It's very late. I did not expect another summer, another child. So much darkness. She trots away to catch it. Probably 9 minutes later, she lopes back, barely winded. There is the light in her cupped hands. She shows it off. Look how it flashes. She will pass it to me. I can feel the little wind and the adamant wing against my palms. My life is almost over. I pass it back. She waves it up dramatically. We watch for a greenish spark. If the night is clear and we can stare up for a full minute, we're guaranteed to see a satellite, a star whose name I know. There are only 5, a glittering meteor, a comet, or the glint of a plane headed for the Arctic. Those towering, ghostly shapes must be the huge, unmoving cumulus of late summer, the clouds Jesus referred to when he said, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." Those close, low, humpbacked shapes must be the fishermen's boats, hauled high and tarped. No lamps on the island. What light there is seems to come from under our sneakers. Now the fireflies are pulsing in phase. You could parse it out like the meter of a fugue. The plan is obvious. Earth will become more and more beautiful until I can't stand it. Then I will vanish. It will be in my mind that the skiffs are hauled up, safe from the wild tide. In my mind that the silly, sleepless accordion plays sweet Lorraine, bland across deep water. I can't see the child, but she takes my pinky almost angrily. She will lead me back to Sheffield, counting our steps on the dark path. When we come to 1,000,000, we will be home. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dennis. That was a fabulous reading, and both were fabulous readings. And I hope that you all will find their books when we are finished with our Q&A, and we will segue into that now. I actually have a question I will start off with, but then I hope some of the rest of you will speak up. And this is a loose sort of conversation. And we always love to hear from you. We have a lot of writers who tend to come to these readings, and so their questions are always welcome and always good. One of the things, so in your poems, both of you explore death a lot. Weave through childhood, love. You have common themes that overlap. And Dennis, you with your very lyrical style that kind of forms layer upon layer and it almost takes on a sort of surreal, and Danny, your images as well can become very surreal in your lyrical way of writing. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your poems begin. Where do you get the idea of a poem, and at what stage in the revision process does it become this kind of, I know it can't be that easy from the beginning, because to read your poems, it seems easy. But I know it's not that easy. So can you talk a little bit about your process? including your revision process at the end. So.
Well, can you hear me? Should I hold
You
this
can,
up?
yeah, that would be fine. And I think you can even take it off the, if that helps.
What?
You can even take it off the stand if you
Oh,
prefer.
I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
I think writing is such a privilege because you can write with yourself over time, your diurnal self. The rest of the life, you're just making a decision which you know you're going to regret the next day. But I love being able to write endless drafts. And when I was a young poet, I thought, they want me to rewrite this poem. This is my poem. I don't want to touch it. But now that I'm an older dude, I just realized that it's such a privilege to step to the plate and be able to take 1,000 swings before that you have the ability to work with yourself over many days or months, so that in a way, time is helping you write the poem. And I'm just so happy that we have that privilege, and so happy that I learned that I shouldn't just write a poem and then defend it against the world and not rewrite it. So I think it does work as kind of a dialogue. You might take notes in a notebook, and they would be in a dialogue with another notebook. And eventually, out of all those dialogues, you find something which you think is a poem. Probably it helps to be damaged, and the world is very helpful in damaging you. So there are lots of advantages to being a poet.
Yeah.
This can't be good. Yes? You hear me? Yeah. I like the puzzle-like aspect of it. I'll have a word or two or something, and my answer is almost precisely what Dennis had to say. It's such a delight to be returned to the same words over and over and over, days and days. I mean, it may take months to get 10 lines sometimes, yes? Does that work for you? Yeah. But it's really a nice place where you reach the point where this is going to be a good poem, or what I think is a good poem, and then it's just playtime. Just this word here, no, over here, no, take that word out, this is better. And I really enjoy that aspect of it, of moving things around and playing once I have the structure. It's a real pain, though, when you can't figure out the first part, the inspiration or what it is that you want to say. But once you know that, it's a joy. Yeah.
So as a follow-up question to that then, or did you want to follow up with that, Dennis? Did you have something?
Just the comment that, you see these books that on the last page it says, Paris, April 1979. And I thought that's so cool, so I would write a book and put Paris, Brooklyn, June 1982, and then I would have to cross it out and put it, Brooklyn, August 1984, and then cross that out. Anyway.
Yeah.
There must be poets who write a poem in a day or an hour, and that's unfathomable to me.
Yeah.
I wish I had it, but I don't.
John Ashbery did,
Yeah.
and he was very modest about it. He would say, I write these things in half an hour like doing a crossword. And I had to admire that honesty, but I can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read in one of the interviews I was looking at that you often used to tell your students that you did not want them to work from the start on perfection. You preferred for it not to be, and even in your own poems, you preferred not to try to strive for perfection because half of the work that you produced, you were going to throw away because you felt as if, early on there was so much to still have to let loose of, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a process of perfecting either. I mean, it's a process of like writing a poem that's true to your experience, if that makes sense, so that your revision could be like to make the poem messier and messier. It's not necessarily cleaning it up.
And I've learned too that even in the worst poem, there'll be 2 or 3 words that will end up somewhere else in a different poem.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, do you start with knowing how the poem will ultimately look on the page? You read a few prose poems at the end. Did you have a sense from the get-go that those would be prose poems, or is it something you recognized in your revision process a little later?
Oh, no, I mean, like if I'm lucky, the poem tells me what kind of poem it is, but I don't know, no. And you want to be in that space, you want to be in that space of, I have no idea what's going to happen. And it's a privilege to be in that space if you can be. I mean, there are times, of course, where like we all get anxious and we want control over the process, and that's problematic. And one suffers when one is in that space.
Yeah. And so you both have taught a lot in the classroom, and if you have a new group of students sitting down for maybe the first week to work out a poem, what advice do you give them for how to start a poem? What do you encourage them to do as they attempt to get ideas on paper?
Well, maybe, I mean, beginnings are very difficult, so maybe don't begin your poem. Start your poem in the middle. I mean, that would be my advice.
Start in the middle, okay.
It's certainly an advice. My wife is a fiction writer, and when she tells a story, she'll start right before the end and then flash back and then come to the end. And that way it's like a bent bow. It's not like a thread that you have to follow. There isn't much power to say, this is A, and then I'm going to B, and then I'm going to C and D.
Yeah.
I would have students in that first week write a few words, maybe a phrase or something on, if we had whiteboards or something, I would have them write a phrase or even a line from somewhere in the poem, and then students often, I would try to get them to see where it might go, other suggestions, and think about this. But yes, I don't think anyone ever started a poem with the first line. Yeah. I think that's disaster in the making. Yeah.
Okay, good. How about the rest of you? Questions for Danny and Dennis?
Well, I want to come back to that, but it's kind of like, jazz music.
There you go.
You get a melody on the first line, da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its steady pace. You have the rest of the poem there, no?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because once you got the rhythm, the rest of the poem kind of just follows.
Yeah, I mean, I play jazz myself. I play the saxophone, and I've played at times with people like Sonny Stitt, and improvisation is similar. I mean, you can't improvise over nothing. You have to have a foundation to improvise. But I mean, I think you're describing it well. Yeah, it's a similar process.
Other questions? Hunt,
Excuse me.
yes.
I also have a microphone for our listeners at home so that they can also hear your questions.
In other countries, poetry seems to matter in different ways than in America. In Krakow, there's a big statue in the main square of Misiewicz, who wrote Pan to Douche, and the Nazis pulled it down in 1939, and the Poles put it back up again in 1946. In Santiago right now, there's a big argument going on about whether to name the airport after Neruda. And in the last couple of weeks, there was a poet in Moscow who did a reading and had a poem about Ukraine, and the police arrested him, and his wife got sentenced to 3 years, and he got sentenced to 7 years. And this kind of thing doesn't seem to happen in America. So my question is, would we want it to? And how do we want poetry to matter in America?
Great question.
I mean, I think poetry does matter in America, but it just doesn't get visibility. I mean, I've taught in MFA programs, but I've also taught in prisons and literacy centers, and I've really had people who were into poetry and who wrote poetry themselves, so that, I mean, I think poetry is very alive in America. You know, Danny has this magazine, Plume, and I think it matters to a lot of people. It's just there is a way where I think our soundbite culture, you know, and sometimes the soundbite culture even applies to poetry, you know, that I was at a conference and the Poetry Foundation had a big display where they gave you a soundbite from every poem they published.
Wow.
It was creepy. I mean, I think our culture is kind of impatient for poetry, but I think it's alive. But
I do too. I think there's more poetry being produced now than ever before. I really do. But and the question I was going to ask you, actually, Dennis, too. You know, you spoke of your childhood and your someone touching your love experimentally. So every one of us here, I would imagine, has a first love, and can even years later, decades later, can conjure their face, perhaps a gesture, perhaps your first kiss. And I think it works that way in poetry too. Who was your first love in poetry?
First
poetry.
love in poetry. The very first love was probably, I don't know if this was a love, it's kind of a love-hate, was Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And that just got to me because everybody was talking about love and happiness. And here's this guy in the same book saying, ashes to ashes, all is vanity. All things are full of labor, words cannot utter it. And the adults were reading all this stuff and their expression didn't change. So I thought maybe there is really contradictory ways of thinking about reality, and maybe this guy Ecclesiastes is right. And then later when I grew up, my mom was French, and I read a lot of Guillaume Apollinaire and your guy Henri Michaud.
How old were you when you encountered Ecclesiastes?
Well, that was when I was a little kid. I mean, Ecclesiastes was sort of shoved down my throat, and I was like everything else in the Bible. And I was kind of like, this is really strange.
Yes. Yeah, I read almost nothing of American poetry for years and years, but I would cut school in my teens and go to the Louisville Public Library, which was funded in part by the Binghams who ran the Courier Journal, and they were real Francophiles. So there was shelves and shelves of French books. And so I did read Michaud and Breton and all of those way before I just thought about American poetry at all, which was a good, and Jean Thalin.
Yeah.
And so those are the people who meant everything to me. And then eventually I found my way back to American poetry, but not until I was in my 20s, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you both may have mentioned at some point in your interviews, I was Gwendolyn Brooks as being a poet that you both think highly of, and you talk about her work. But both of you have lived in other countries. I mean, for periods of time, and I noticed that you were very influenced by many of the poets that you read in those countries. Can you talk a little bit about how place plays a role in your poems, either while you were living in those countries or once you came back to the United States or moved to the United States? How does place play a role for you as you write your poems?
I think when I lived overseas, I was mostly in France and England, and just trying to get by day to day. I had no money and that sort of thing. But the place part, obviously, through these poems, it's really my youth, my childhood, and
Both of you.
in Louisville. Yeah, I think so too. The most important and formative experiences I've had were up until I was 18 or so in Louisville, Kentucky. And we moved here 30 years ago, but I've never felt like this was my home, I don't think.
Florida, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. It's back there. It's back there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, place to me was kind of estrangement. You know, I was born in New York, but my family was from Europe. We moved back there. My dad died. They came back here. I have family in Estonia. I'm still in touch with them. I did a book in Estonia just last year, so that there's a lot of distance, and that's been good, feeling like a stranger. I should also say that in all cultures, including this culture, people were nice to me, so that I didn't have the experience of being a persecuted stranger, but I had the experience of not really knowing what was happening, which is probably good for a writer.
Coming back to this about your language of, I'll make it louder, but both being bilingual, Estonian and French, and how that informs your poetry. You read mostly French, and how when you hear French, you think French, you get the rhythm of French. I don't know Estonians, but I imagine there is that rhythm, and how does that second language, and I think that to me is really important for a lot of poets who have second, third, fourth languages. You think in different parts of your brain. How would you respond to that?
I think that's a great question. I think some of it is just more, it's sort of like having binocular vision. You don't take any rhythm for granted if you have more than one rhythm as a possibility in your mind. Though I have to say, I don't really speak Estonian. I do speak French, which was my mom's language.
I'm sort of I was an autodidact, so when I saw this shelves and shelves of French books, there's a really great series, anybody wants to do this. It's called French for Reading Knowledge, and they still make it. It's like 40 years ago. But you can teach yourself enough to read French. And if you have a Kindle now, you can read French and put your finger on a noun that you don't recognize, and up comes the definition in French. It's pretty nice. But I remember reading so I taught myself French probably in my young middle teens or something, and would go back and read these books. And it didn't make a lot of sense. I'd miss a lot, I'm sure. But when I finally got to read them, the Surrealists in particular, and then I saw you remember Michael Benedict's anthology? It's like such a crucial book.
Yeah.
So it's English-French side by side, and then, no, it isn't. But I would read the English versions first, because that's what I knew, and then I would read the French versions of Surrealist poems. I was so disappointed. They seemed so sing-songy, and I thought, because the French that were translated were so flat, which I really liked. In Opata, we were speaking of Nican Opata, and the translations, the anti-poems are so flat, and it's just gorgeous. I love that style. Then I saw the sort of ornamentation of the Surrealists, and I was disappointed.
Yeah, it's kind of like Nican Opata doesn't really make sense in English.
But it does in a different way. It's a,
Yeah,
it's
I
a-
know what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's kind of like how certain languages, you have the rhythm, the texture.
Yes,
That
I'm
you
sure it's
just
completely-
can't quite get into
Oh, I'm
that
sure that's
second
true.
language.
But Merwin doing Jean Fallon.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly good in English.
Yeah, even Heather McHugh does
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
But that's what's amazing about poetry is just sometimes I think of it as maybe you don't have a horizontal immortality, but I mean a vertical immortality, but that's kind of a horizontal immortality. You know, you can enter another person's mind, you can enter another culture, and that poetry is instinctual. It's a naked art form, so that, you know, you're confronting somebody else's instincts when they represent an entirely different culture, and I think it's great. It's a privilege.
More questions? There's one in the back. Joy?
Can I give somebody a microphone back there?
Yeah.
Thank you both for being here. At the beginning, we were kind of talking about your revision process, and I'm just wondering how you decide when you're finished with a poem.
Good question.
Don't know. It feels good, I guess, right? It feels like it's done. And
How do you know a poem is finished? I mean, it is a trial and error thing, and as I was saying before, I often know, but I'm often wrong. You know, I think probably poets have this. You write a poem and you think, I am so amazing, and then next day you read the poem and think, I am worse than a cockroach. You know, so that
yeah.
I do know that a poem is finished, but I don't trust that knowledge. I mean, I might have to live with it for a couple months before I can trust it.
And generally, it's more than you want to take away things more than add. Almost always, you take away. At least I do. I take away rather than add.
But you know, you send out the poem, and if it's not finished, the person you're going to send it to will let you know.
They let you know.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes over time, depending on how much time goes by before you revisit that poem, you know, you may be coming back to it and you've changed.
Yeah.
Oh,
And your eye is different, and what you think the poem is about maybe has changed. And
That's
that's,
good, yeah.
you know, it kind of shakes it up even further.
That's the way it's kind of important not to be too perfectionist or judgmental. You know, I mean, I was interviewing the great poet Sharon Olds, you know, and she said something like, I've spent my life writing bad poems. She said it very proudly, you know, and she had the courage to do that, you know, whereas I think sometimes I tell, or my students feel, I have to write a good poem, it has to begin, it has to end. And it's kind of, you have to create your own landscape that you can wander around. Otherwise, you're sort of censoring yourself or making the process really painful, where it should be kind of ecstatic. After all, there are a lot of people in the world who would rather write poems than mine coal, so you ought to have a good time writing your poems.
You know, you were speaking about poetry overseas, and that was what struck me first when I began reading particularly the Eastern Europeans, and the poetry seemed so much more important. This was in the late 60s, I suppose, but poetry seemed terribly important in a way that American poetry did not. That it was a life and death, it was a matter of, I have to do this. And I've always looked for that, I guess, everywhere, that whoever wrote something, in a way, it had to do it. And I miss that. I guess I don't see it as much in American poetry.
But if I can say one thing that's sort of in defense of American poetry, I mean, French poetry is great. French people don't really read that much poetry these days. I mean, the golden age was more in the 1930s. You know, in France, people say, c'est un poème, it's a poem. That means like It was so terrible. But anyway, and their cultures, Neruda in Chile, he was kind of a superstar, and there were a lot of Chilean poets who felt, why is this guy getting all the attention? So that, there's something to be said for our invisible democratic culture, and we have things like the blues, that are American identity, and they're important, Spain has flamenco, but the blues is not something to take lightly.
Yeah, interesting. It's true. It's true. There's a wonderful poet whom I met many years ago at the Swanee Writers Conference. His name is Chardinho. Did I pronounce it correctly? Yeah. And you did a wonderful interview with him. It's terrific, and I found it online. And you had this one line in there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that you want your poems, and I think you said even your book, to speak for brokenness. You want your poems, you want your book to speak for brokenness, was a quote that I took from that interview. And I really loved that. And I feel like somehow that is maybe tied into even some of the poems abroad. I think in some places they do, maybe even more. But I love that. I love that thought. Could you just talk for a minute about that?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm interested in people who are broken and situations that are broken. Clearly we live in a world that's broken right now, and I don't think there's any way of putting it back together, so we have to understand the brokenness of it. Dostoevsky said spirituality is a way of being visibly broken. I don't know if I was quoting Dostoevsky, but it certainly speaks to what I'm trying to do. Danny.
Dostoevsky, yeah. Did you read Cioran as well? E.M. Cioran.
Yeah.
He's an aphoristic philosopher, and they call him the last philosopher in Europe. But if you get a chance, I would say he is so bleak that he's hilarious. Do you find that? He's really a funny guy. It's just so terrible, terrible things. So if you get a chance, his last name is Cioran, but he has that sense of brokenness over and over and over. He was a Romanian and astonishingly went to France and wrote in French, which I find just beyond me, that he was able to do what he did in a second language. But yeah, E.M. Cioran, pretty great. But that sense of brokenness is, his titles are The Temptation to Exist, The Trouble with Being Born. Yeah, light verse again. But he has that sense that, and it's you're right, it is entirely part of the American culture. It's universal. And poets are drawn to that, I think, to brokenness. Yeah, because they themselves often are broken, you think.
But what I love about your work, both of you, is that you do get that sense that that's what you're addressing in many, many of your poems. But you are still so tied to the world. Your poems have so much of what I would call the stuff of the world in them. So if that seems like a pretty abstract thought to say the poem should be about brokenness, but you never do it that way, and you hang tight to the image in your poems, and in your own ways of writing, I think it's just so beautifully handled, and I think it's so important to do it that way. So, yeah. Any other questions for these two poets? Well, how about a big round of applause for Dennis Christie? And they will go out front and sign books. I hope you will buy them. Let me mention just a couple of things. On April 11th, we will have our second open mic poetry evening. If you were here last time, it was a big hit. It was standing room only. We had a lot of people performing. It was a lot of fun. We will be partnering again with Grow House from Tampa. Curtis Davis and Dennis Amadeus will be here. And then on April 25th, for National Poetry Month, we will have Jericho Brown, the amazing poet Jericho Brown here. And we're partnering with Eckerd College for that event, and that'll be here at the Dalí. So hope you can join us for both of those events. So thank you so much again, you guys. And thank you all for being here.